This is the story of the forgotten soldier and of the general who, according to the accounts that have circulated ever since, refused to let him stay forgotten. By the fourth winter of the war, the United States Army had become a machine for processing human beings at a scale nobody had ever quite planned for. Millions of men had passed through induction centers, training camps, troopships, and finally the mud of Normandy, Lorraine, and the Ardennes, and every one of them, in theory, was owed a paper trail. Citations for gallantry were meant to move upward through a chain of command that stretched from a corporal's scribbled account, through a company commander, a battalion adjutant, a regimental staff officer, and eventually to a review board somewhere well behind the lines. In practice, that chain broke constantly. Officers who witnessed an act of courage were themselves killed a week later, taking the details with them. Company clerks lost forms in the chaos of a retreat or an advance. Divisions rotated in and out of the line so quickly that paperwork begun in one sector was never finished in another. Estimates compiled after the war suggested that the ratio of documented acts of extraordinary courage to actual awards granted was lopsided in ways that embarrassed even the Army's own historians, and unofficial figures circulating among veterans' associations decades later spoke of tens of thousands of recommendations that simply evaporated somewhere in the machinery. The problem was not merely bureaucratic laziness, though there was plenty of that. It was structural. The United States Army in Europe by late 1944 numbered well over 3 million men, spread across dozens of divisions, and the review boards responsible for validating medal citations were chronically understaffed and permanently behind schedule. A Silver Star recommendation might take months to clear even in quiet periods. During the ferocious fighting of the autumn of 1944, when Patton's Third Army alone was averaging casualties in the low thousands per week, the system buckled entirely. Men were wounded, killed, rotated home, or simply forgotten before their citations ever reached a signature. And, unlike a wound stripe or a campaign ribbon, awarded almost automatically, a decoration for valor required someone, somewhere, to actively remember an individual soldier's name and deed months after the moment itself had passed into the general blur of an advancing front. This was the environment in which the encounter on the Metz Road is said to have taken place, and it explains why the moment, real or embellished, resonated so strongly with the men who told and retold it. It was not simply about one soldier. It was about the thousands like him, standing in the cold, doing exactly what was asked of them, and vanishing into the paper fog of an army too vast to notice. George Smith Patton III was by 1944 one of the most recognizable and most divisive commanders in the American Army. A man whose reputation combined genuine tactical brilliance with a personal style that oscillated between inspirational and disastrous. He had, by that point in the war, already survived the fallout from slapping 2 hospitalized soldiers in Sicily the previous year, an episode that very nearly ended his career and that Eisenhower himself had been forced to manage through private reprimand rather than public disgrace. Whatever else can be said about Patton, he was a man acutely conscious of his own image, of the mythology building around him, and of the gap between how the press portrayed him and how his own men experienced him day to day. What is well documented, separate from the checkpoint story itself, is Patton's habit of personally intervening in matters of recognition when he judged the system had failed. The clearest and best-sourced example comes from the very end of his command of the Third Army, when he personally awarded a Silver Star to his longtime driver, Master Sergeant John Mims, a decoration technically reserved for gallantry under fire that a driver, however loyal, would not conventionally have qualified for through the normal citation process. Patton pushed it through anyway, writing to his wife that he had, in his own words, fought for 3 years to secure a Distinguished Service Medal for 10 of his own staff, a fight against exactly the kind of institutional inertia that swallowed so many ordinary soldiers' citations whole. In another well-attested episode, Patton personally pinned a Bronze Star on the chest of his Third Army chaplain, James O'Neill, after O'Neill produced a weather prayer that Patton, only half joking, credited with clearing the skies for Third Army's relief of Bastogne. In both cases, the pattern is the same. Patton identifying a deserving man the formal system had missed, or would, never have reached on its own, and using the authority of his own signature to correct it on the spot, bypassing weeks or months of review. It is against this backdrop that the story of the soldier on the Metz road should be understood. Whether that precise encounter happened exactly as popularly told, with the sleet and the silent salute and the general climbing down from his jeep to ask the man's name himself, is not something that can be verified against a service record in any archive known to historians. What can be said with confidence is that it fits a documented pattern of behavior, that Patton did personally intervene to secure decorations for individual soldiers he encountered or was told about, that he kept a small personal list of names to follow up on, according to several of his staff officers' post-war memoirs, and that soldiers of the Third Army came to believe, rightly or wrongly, that a chance meeting with their commanding general carried real weight, in a way that a meeting with almost any other senior officer in the European theater did not. If this story is holding your attention, a quick subscribe genuinely helps this channel keep telling the one's history nearly lost. The mechanics of how such an intervention might actually have worked are worth understanding, because they illuminate just how personal and how fragile the whole system of recognition really was. When Patton wanted a citation processed, he did not wait for the normal chain. He would instruct his aide to take down the soldier's name, unit, and the substance of the act on the spot, sometimes on nothing more than a scrap of notebook paper, and that scrap would then be walked directly to Third Army's G1 personnel section, with the general's verbal instruction attached, effectively vaulting the request past the multi-week queue that an ordinary citation would otherwise have joined. It was, in effect, a shortcut built entirely on personal authority, the kind of shortcut that only works in an organization where one man's word genuinely overrides the usual paperwork, for better and for worse. Historians have noted that this same willingness to bypass procedure, which could produce moments of genuine justice for an overlooked soldier, was the identical character trait that produced the slapping incidents in Sicily, an impulsiveness that answered to no committee. Compare this with how the German army handled recognition in the same period, and the contrast is instructive. The Wehrmacht's decoration system was, on paper, more centralized and more rigidly bureaucratic than the American equivalent, with the Iron Cross and its various grades processed through a chain that, by the later years of the war, was creaking under exactly the same pressures of scale and chaos, but with even less scope for a single commander to intervene personally on a passing soldier's behalf, given the rigid hierarchy that discouraged frontline generals from short-circuiting divisional and corps-level review. British practice sat somewhere in between. The military medal and military cross were processed through regimental recommendation with a comparatively strong tradition of commanding officers personally championing citations for their own men, a culture arguably closer to Patton's instinct than to the more impersonal American review boards further up the chain, though even in the British system, the sort of unscripted battlefield intervention attributed to Patton on the Metz road had no real institutional equivalent, nothing quite like it appears in the memoirs of Montgomery or Alexander, both of whom were, by comparison, considerably more distant from individual soldiers in the ranks. What actually happened to the man at that checkpoint, assuming the story has a genuine kernel, is impossible to establish with certainty. No service record has ever been definitively matched to the encounter, no citation bears an unambiguous note referencing a chance roadside meeting with Patton in November 1944, and the story's transmission through decades of retelling, veterans' reunions, and eventually internet retellings has almost certainly smoothed away whatever specific, verifiable details it once possessed. What survives is not a documented case file but a kind of composite memory, built from dozens of genuinely attested Patton interventions of the Mims and O'Neill variety, condensed by decades of storytelling into a single vivid, cinematic scene that has become, whether accurate in its particulars or not, a shorthand for something soldiers of the Third Army did believe about their commander. that he looked at them individually in a way the wider machinery of the army did not. The psychological effect of that belief, whatever its factual foundation, was real and is well documented independently. Third Army soldiers' letters home, collected in post-war oral history projects, repeatedly describe a sense that Patton knew who they were, that he watched them, that a chance encounter with him on a road might change their fortunes for good or ill. That belief did something no formal decoration policy could achieve on its own. It made ordinary soldiers feel individually seen inside an army of millions, and it is precisely that feeling, more than any single verified anecdote, which explains why stories like the one on the Metz Road have survived so vividly for 8 decades, retold at reunions, printed in regimental histories, and now reaching new audiences online, each time with the same emotional core intact, even as the factual edges blur. The legacy of this pattern extends well beyond Patton's own service. The recognition problem he was informally solving, one impulsive intervention at a time, was one that the American military took seriously enough after the war to reform, streamlining the citation review process and, in later conflicts, pushing decoration authority further down the chain of command precisely so that fewer deserving soldiers would vanish into the same paperwork fog that swallowed so many in 1944. Surviving artifacts connected to the genuinely documented cases, including material relating to the Mims and O'Neill decorations, are held today in American military archives and in the collection of the General George Patton Museum of Leadership at Fort Knox, Kentucky, alongside the uniform, pistols, and personal effects that have made Patton one of the most instantly recognizable American commanders of the entire war. Return for a moment to that road outside Metz, to the Sleet coming down sideways and the soldier standing at his post while the convoys pass him by. Whether the encounter happened exactly as it has been told, or whether it is a composite born of a dozen smaller, better documented acts of the same character, it endures because it captures something true about war that no citation form ever could: that courage is common and recognition is rare, that an army can process 3 million men and still lose track of the ones who matter most, and that it sometimes takes nothing more than one person choosing to stop, to ask a name, and to write it down. Patton was not a saint. He was vain, impulsive, and capable of real cruelty, and the same instinct that let him rescue a forgotten soldier's citation from oblivion also let him strike a hospitalized man across the face in front of his comrades. But in the story of the checkpoint on the Metz Road, whatever its precise factual weight, lies a simple and enduring truth about recognition in war: that it is never automatic, never guaranteed, and never truly finished until someone with the power to act chooses to notice. Somewhere in the archives, in the citations that did survive, in the medals that did eventually reach the men who earned them, that choice is written down in black and white. For the countless others whose moment of courage never found its way onto paper at all, the Sleet on that road outside Metz remains, in the end, the closest thing to a monument they will ever have.